Okay, so today, my talk is called "Through the Fire and the Flames," which is a little bit of a reference to the heavy metal song by Dragon Force, but whatever. All right, if you were here on Sunday, I'm doing a little variations. So Dan, Hickey, and I didn't talk about it, but we ended up kind of overlapping on some themes, I think in a good way. Jazz, somebody lays down the melody, somebody else does a variation. We ended up talking about a little bit of the same things. And today what I'm focusing on is kind of the religious approach or the Christian approach to suffering, and I wanted to get into that a little bit. One of the common things about all people, I think, is we really want a narrative on suffering. So in other words, when something bad happens that feels like it can't be explained, we really, really badly want a narrative. For instance, you make a bad grade, a D minus. My students inform me that like C is failing, whatever. All right, so you make like a D minus on a quiz or something, you immediately want some kind of narrative on it, right? You want like, well, I didn't study hard enough, or I'm just stupid, or you have some kind of narrative or I'm a failure, whatever. You have a narrative that you immediately plug in to explain the difficult thing you're going for. It's kind of a natural thing that we as people do. In the hardest times are the things where something really dramatic and awful happens, like a car accident that takes someone's life or something like that. And those narratives that you're trying to come up with to explain why that happened, why there's still value, can be really difficult. But everyone tries to do it. In the worst situations, everybody's always trying to figure out some kind of story that explains why that awful thing happened. If you listen to anyone who's suffered in a big way, this is a pretty common thing for all people to do. Well, Christianity doesn't answer why there is suffering, but it does give a potential benefit, actually, something that comes out of suffering, and it comes from this shocking little passage in James, which says this: "Count it all joy, my brothers and sisters, when you meet trials of various kinds. For you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness, and let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing." That's a tough passage. And before I dig into it, I want to talk about smoke jumpers. Okay, history lesson. This is actually pretty cool. In the 40s, they decided that in the West, these fires just kept popping up, wiping people out, wiping out towns, and they're like, we need some kind of active program to go against these fires faster. We need to train young men to parachute out of airplanes, to get as close to the fires as possible, to begin putting them out before they reach populations, before they reach people, before they start to hurt people. And so they started this program, and it ran for about 9 years, longer, but at this point, where my story picks up in 1949, it's been running for 9 years, and it's gone really well. And so these young men would dedicate like a whole summer. They would come in, they would train jumping out of airplanes. This is a pretty awesome way to spend your summer. They would wait, they would get a call, there'd be some smoke that would come up, they would fly over, they would parachute out, they would bring all their equipment, they would go, they would start digging trenches, they would fight the fires right there. Well, this particular fire that I'm going to talk about, August 5th, is actually a pretty famous fire in the history of firefighting, is the Mann Gulch Valley fire. So that behind me is a picture of the Mann Gulch Valley. So this particular day, there are 15 men, or 16 men, I think, who get on this plane. They receive a call that there is fire going on in the Mann Gulch Valley. They get on this plane. They take off to go to work. In the corner is Warner Dodge. He is the head of this group of young men who's going to go into battle against this fire. He's like 33 years old, and he's 10 years older than anyone else in the smoke jumper program. Okay, he's the leader of these guys, that kind of thing. They jump out of the plane, they gather their equipment. As they set up a base camp, Warner Dodge thinks he hears the voice of somebody calling out for him and says, "You guys go ahead and march towards the fire. I'm going to go check on this voice." Warner Dodge goes and he finds James Harrison. James Harrison had spent the last 4 hours, he's the one who called in the fire, he had spent the last 4 hours fighting this small fire by himself. And so Warner Dodge finds James, says, "Team up with us, we'll come with my group." Well, as he's beginning to head back towards his men, he realizes that this fire is spreading much, much faster than he could have anticipated. In fact, it's about to cover 3,000 acres in 10 minutes. It's just going to wipe everything out. And so as he's going as fast as he can to get to his men who are in the middle of this valley, he reaches them and says, guys, we are all about to die. Because the fire at this point has gone from one end of the valley to the other. A spark has dragged it across, and it's now moving towards the middle where they are. And he tells them, guys, you have to drop your packs right now. Our only hope is to make it up top the ridge. Drop your packs and run. The kicker is only about half the men actually drop their packs. Only half obey him. They're like, nope, my pack is what's going to get me through. They keep it on. So they begin to sprint full speed. They're running to get out of this valley. They're heading up the ridge. It's unbelievably steep. It's like a 70-degree incline. And as they're going up, at some point, Warner turns around and he sees that this fire is coming up way faster than he anticipated and that they're done for unless he does something right then. And so on the spot, he invents a technique that only works in very rare circumstances. But he invents this technique on the spot called an escape fire. And what he does is he quickly puts together a bunch of dried leaves and sticks in front of him, takes a match, lights it, and lights a fire in front of him. And his thinking is, if I can light a fire in front of me and clear out this little space, there will be nothing left to burn in this space. So I'm going to make this fire, I'm going to burn it all up, and I'm going to get in that spot before the fire gets there. Well, he turns to his men and he says, guys, quit running. We're not going to make it. You got to trust me. Takes out a thing of matches, lights it, throws it down, and they all look at him and say, forget you, and just keep running. Well, at that point, there's not much he can do for them. And so the fire's coming up. He finishes his escape fire. He takes a handkerchief, wets it, puts it over his face. He lays down in the escape fire in that patch that he's cleared out, and the fire blows by him. And he said it was so hot, he literally felt himself being lifted up off the ground. It comes by, and 3 minutes later, he stands up, and all of his men but two are dead. The two who survived managed to get to the top, and they didn't actually make it up the ridge. They found this crevice that they hid in, but the rest of them were all burned alive. Now, this was a huge thing in firefighting, and ever since this moment, they revised their standards on what it meant to fight fires and all those kinds of things. But what's interesting to me is Warner Dodge was completely right at every step. At every step, he told his men, drop the pack. It's not going to save you. He said, trust me. And I know he must have looked insane when that fire was coming and he was lighting matches and throwing them on the ground. But if they had trusted him in that moment, if they had said, this guy has 10, 12 more years of expertise than I do. This guy knows what he's doing. I'm going to trust him. Imagine the lessons they would have learned. They would have learned he was a good guide, that he takes care of his people, all of those kinds of things. And they didn't. Well, I feel like we are frequently like the men who followed up Warner Dodge in that even those of us who are religious, I think we say yeah, I think God's good and will take care of me. But when the rubber really hits the road, when it's like, hey, bad things are coming, you gotta trust me, that pack's not going to save you. We say, no, I'm going to take care of this myself. When it gets really important, it's all on me. I'm keeping my pack. I'm running as hard as I can. I'm not going to trust you. So because we don't often trust God as our guide, we don't really understand the best way through suffering. And we avoid the path that would save us. But I want to argue today that because God is a good guide, like Warner Dodge was for his men, we can follow him through suffering and into life. So the first crazy thing that James actually says is that we can rejoice in suffering because it strengthens our faith. Now, this sounds a little crazy. And actually, the way James says it is you can imagine, James, this is the brother of Jesus. So he's had some suffering himself. Jesus has died on the cross. His brother died. He's looking out on this audience, and he starts just kind of with this mic drop moment. And he knows everybody in his audience has suffered in great ways. And he says, hey, count it all joy, my brothers and sisters, when you meet trials of various kinds, for you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. Now, when I first hear this, I actually kind of want a way out of it. I'm like, that sounds a little crazy. Okay, count it all joy when you meet trials of various kinds. I'm like, well, maybe he just means when you're persecuted for doing good things. That sounds reasonable to me. Consider it all joy when you're persecuted for doing reasonable things. But he cuts that off. No. When you meet trials of various kinds, like any trials, Like, okay, well, maybe, I don't know, sickness or something. Maybe that makes sense to me. And then he puts the qualifier on it. He says, for you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. He's like, what kind of trials am I talking about? I'm talking about when you go through something so tough that it makes you question your faith. Like it makes you wonder who God is, if he's really out there, if he really cares. That's the kind of trials I'm talking about. So he's not cutting any shortcuts here. He's like, consider it all joy when something mildly difficult happens to you and you're inconvenienced for the day. He's like, no, count it all joy when you run into that thing that makes you go, whoa, does God care about me? That's the one I want you to count as all joy. So then I'm like, well, okay, but does that just mean I have to be happy all the time? Seniors, you're about to graduate. This is probably exactly what you'll look like. Amazing. Does that mean I have to be happy all the time? And when I think about that, right, count it all joy. If you've ever, maybe this is you, and I'm sorry if I'm ratting on you, but that person who's like willfully happy to the point of being annoying, yes? Is anybody? This was probably me in high school. Like willfully happy, like you're going through tough stuff, and you're like, no, I dig it, I'm great. I also, don't point at anybody, I also think this is not what James is talking about. Because if we think about Jesus, when Lazarus dies, he cries. He's not like, ha-ha, Lazarus died. Woo, sweet, rejoicing in suffering. So it's not that either. It's not that either, okay? So it's got to be something, deeper. It's got to be something bigger. And why then? Why could I have joy when I'm suffering? And James puts it this way. So count it all joy when you meet trials of various kinds. You know the testing of your faith produces steadfastness, and let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. Another way to say this is the Message puts it this way. Consider it a sheer gift, friends, when tests and challenges come at you from all sides. You know that under pressure, your faith life is forced into the open and shows its true colors. So don't try to get out of anything prematurely. Let it do its work so you become mature and well-developed, not deficient in any way. The joy comes from the fact that what he's saying is, as you go through suffering, it is one of the places where you can actually draw nearer to God. That when you're suffering, when you're in a tough situation, and you begin to cry out to God, that is actually one of the places that can draw you nearer to God. And because of that, and because you know God can draw you nearer through that, you can take joy in the fact that through this process, I can grow closer to the person who loves me, the one who loves me. This is a picture of my father-in-law reading to my two sons. Mark, he is a great guy. My kids have been, George looks kind of sick in that picture. My kids have been sick all week. They've been like throwing up all the time. I literally spent Sunday night, I'm on the sofa, Murray's on the sofa, and I would just lay there and I'd hear him start to cough, shoot up, put a bedpan beside him, he'd throw up into it, put the bedpan down, and we'd fall back asleep. And that was like every 15 minutes for like 4 hours. So that's awesome. George's way of coping with sickness is every 30 minutes he comes up to you and goes, "Can we snuggle?" And then my wife and I were like, is there any other question you would ever say? Would you ever say no to that question? Like George, like, "Can I please snuggle with you? I am sick." And you'd be like, "No." Wouldn't happen. Anyway, I've told this story before, but Mark, my father-in-law, is a great guy, and he works over in Saudi Arabia. And he does good work, and he believes that God has called him to do that work. And he went out there before 2001, before September 11th. And when he went out, all his family was really confused by this decision. They were like, this is not 100% on board with this. And he would explain, like, it wasn't a dumb decision I made. I really think God's led us to do this. I think our family is supposed to be here, et cetera, et cetera. Well, then 2001 happened. And then the calls really started coming, like, to him from his family, like, all right, time's up in the Middle East, right? You're coming back. And his answer was the right one, like, count it all joy when you face trials of various kinds. He's like, why, if God has called me here and it's difficult now, why would I leave? This is the place where God wants me. This is the place where I can meet God. Actually leaning into the suffering is the way to go. It's like Warner Dodge has lit the fire and he's like, sit here with me. We're going to lean into this suffering. We're not going to run away from it. We're going to face it together. That's what Mark does. Consider it sheer gift when tests and challenges come at you from all sides. So don't try to get out of anything prematurely. I love the way that's worded. Well, you might still go, okay, so you're saying that suffering is just like a self-improvement project, right? Suffering is just like something that's going to make me a better person or something. That's nice unless you have like a really serious debilitating disease. Then I'd say it's like mildly offensive, maybe totally offensive, if the whole point of this thing is that it's going to make me stronger, it's going to make me self-improvement. But I think if we think that, we haven't fully grasped what is going on with Christianity. So Christianity is like this. You're a house. Congratulations. You're a house, and you entrust yourself to a master builder. And you know there's some things that need to be fixed in your house. Like some pipes need to be fixed, and this table needs to be fixed, and yeah, we need to fix that doorway and that kind of thing. And so the master builder comes in and begins to work on those things, and you agree with that. You're like, yeah, I do have a bad temper. Yeah, I could be kind of envious and jealous. Let's chunk that stuff. But then he starts to like rip out the garage, and he blows up your basement and begins to tear out all the windows and do all this junk, and you're like, whoa, my house didn't need all this. Chill out, right? And what you begin to realize, though, is that this master builder is not just renovating the house. This master builder is turning this house into a palace for the king to live in. That's what the Christian life is like. It's not just like mild renovations. It's like a totally reconstructing everything for the king. And I think if we don't recognize how good ultimately the goal is of being with God, then it would seem really tough to say that suffering brings us closer to God. You'd be like, well, it's not worth it. Well, if God is pathetic, then yeah, it's not worth it. But if God is this beautiful, awesome thing, that it could be the greatest thing we achieve, then it is worth it. C.S. Lewis says this, Christ says, give me all. I don't want so much of your time and so much of your money and so much of your work. I want you. I have not come to torment your natural self, but to kill it. No half measures are any good. I don't want to cut off a branch here and a branch there. I want to have the whole tree down. Hand over the whole natural self, all the desires which you think innocent, as well as the ones you think wicked, the whole outfit. I'll give you a new self instead. In fact, I'll give you me. So count it all joy when you face sufferings of various kinds. Well, this sounds really hard. In fact, this almost sounds impossible, I think, which is why it's good that the next point, so we can rejoice in suffering because it strengthens our faith, but this is really hard. I made Tim Stone happy. There's a picture of, I assume that's really hard. Does anyone do any climbing? Is that actually like super easy to do? And I just don't know. I have hands in the back. Is that super easy to do? No. Yes. It's very hard. Okay. Thanks, Enoch. All right. This is a really hard thing to do, right? Well, okay, so how do I rejoice in suffering? The next point that James goes on is God actually grants us wisdom. So you guys saw me all at the beginning of the year. I was walking around with a Rubik's Cube all the time. All right, a beautiful thing happened with the Rubik's Cube. Firstly, I learned that like all of you are good with Rubik's Cubes, which is hilarious and really weird. And apparently there was some class like in the 3rd grade where they had like Rubik's Cube Day, and all you guys learned the Rubik's Cube. Anyway, amazing how many of you know the Rubik's Cube. Why don't you put that on your college resumes? I can do the Rubik's Cube. You should do it. The Rubik's Cube, I'm working on it like for 2 weeks, and finally something happens like the second week as I'm working on the Rubik's Cube is I begin to like see the cube differently. It's like that moment in the Matrix reference. Yeah, it's like the moment in the Matrix where he finally realizes, a computer. Anyway, it's like the Rubik's Cube. I can finally see it differently. I can see the patterns coming together. It's almost like a second vision. It feels physical. My hands start moving faster than my brain. I've heard of people, musicians doing this, where it feels like it's finally unlocked and suddenly things are easier. My dad is a Spanish teacher, Senor Barber, and Senor Barber. He loves learning languages, and his benchmark for when he's learned a language is when I have a dream in that language, I've learned it. So he feels like if you have it on such a subconscious level that you dream in that language that you've arrived. So like there would be times when I was growing up, we'd wake up, we'd be eating breakfast, and he'd come out and be like, I had a dream in German. Boom! And so he'd finally, in his mind, learned German, right? And he would do this. So this idea of like this second vision, Like I see things in a different way. And the Bible's all about this second vision. What Mr. Hickey spoke about when he showed us his oars on Sunday, he spoke about the Old Testament is full of this second vision. Like, man, that army looks really big. There's no way we can win. And somehow God's people pull it off. Man, the Red Sea is really wide and none of us can swim. And it's not impossible. He splits it. Man, Sarah, how could she have a baby and she's, really old and it seems like it's past and she gives birth? It's constantly over and over and over. The Bible is actually about there are other things that show there's something else going on besides the physical landscape, right? There's this spiritual vision that you can see. And so James actually says this, if any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask God who gives generously to all without reproach, and it will be given to him. And it means, if you're struggling at this, if you're like, man, I look at suffering and I only see bad things, I see no way that's valuable, ask God about it. Pray to him for wisdom that you can see something on top of the physical landscape. And so it's kind of like maybe the priorities of God are not like, dear God, please help, please help me to have a good day. But maybe it's more like praying for the spiritual things of, dear God, please help me to serve people who are lonely today, right? Instead of constantly praying about our own grades, like, Father, my friend seems really anxious about their grades. Help me to serve that person. I feel like once we begin to see this way, the things that God cares about are not necessarily the things that we pray about all the time. Dear God, help me get into good college probably isn't as strong a prayer to God as, dear God, help me to be virtuous and serve once I get there, right? Help me to be patient and calm in the process of applying. Help me to be patient and calm in my classes. Help me to serve and love other people. Give me the wisdom to see this, to see the people who are lonely and hurting, because that's actually what you care about more than my 3.7 or whatever. So we can rejoice in suffering because God grants us wisdom, but it does say that you need to be all in. Let him ask in faith with no doubting, for the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea that is driven and tossed by the wind. For that person must not suppose he will receive anything from the Lord. He's a double-minded man, unstable in all his ways. What James is getting at is, at some point, as you're following God and believe that he is the ultimate thing, he may actually ask you to take the pack off. Those things that you cling to for your security, like this is how I define myself, my grades or whatever, or my good looks or whatever it is, at some point he might be like, dude, it's not going to save you. The fire's coming. We're going to die. Take the pack off. Don't cling to those things. They're not going to get you through this. The only way you get through this is if you trust me. I just got an update letter from the Hicks. Some of you met them. This is Doug and Cheryl Hicks' son, Jonathan Hicks, and his big family. And I was thinking about them because I think in a lot of ways they've taken the pack off. They've made a lot of decisions that look ridiculous unless God is real, I think. They have dedicated their lives to serving other people. They've cut themselves off from a lot of modern conveniences and comforts. They've put their children in a tougher situation because of it. And because they know that these things lead them closer to God, because they know that's where he is, they are totally cool with doing that, right? They're willing to take the pack off. They're willing to follow God. They believe he's a good guide. He's going to take care of them. And that's kind of what James is saying, like, hey, be ready if you ask for this. If you ask to start seeing, God, let me see where your heart breaks. It might lead you to do some crazy things. It might lead you to do some things that rub people the wrong way, right? It might lead you to make that call to your parents and say like, hey, you know how I'm going to actually spend this summer? I'm going to go serve people in this place. And it's not just for my resume. It's because I actually love people. I'm sorry. I know this is not 100% with the plan. It might lead you to do some dangerous things. And this is what James is saying. Be careful if you ask for this. Because once you start noticing people who are hurting, it's going to change the way. You might even hurt more as you begin to serve them. And he gives an example of this second vision. Let the lowly brother boast in his exaltation and the rich in his humiliation, because like a flower of the grass, he will pass away. For the sun rises with its scorching heat and withers the grass, its flower falls and its beauty perishes. So also will the rich man fade away in the midst of his pursuits. James is immediately saying, all those things that we cling to for our security, just don't do it. You know, one of the crazy things about, I've mentioned several times before that my brother had a stroke when he was like 21, and it's permanently handicapped him. He can't use the left side of his body very well. He's married. He has a daughter. And one of the things about watching my brother have this stroke and go through all this stuff is it actually immediately convinced me there were some things that I was tempted to rely on for security that I realized, like, it would not have mattered how much money my brother had. It could not have saved him, right? It wouldn't have mattered how big my brother's house was. It couldn't have saved him from that stroke. Nothing that he could have done on this earth could have done that. The most important thing about my brother's life would be that he trusted God. Because as you can imagine, you can struggle with serious depression after stuff like that. The most important thing would be his faith in God. No money would have done it. I was reading a book recently. Chuck Klosterman wrote this book, and he's interviewing all these pop stars who are really famous, have made tons of money. And the one through line on all these are all people who have like everything that you would imagine, is that they're really deeply unhappy, and they're deeply trying to convince everyone that they're unhappy, and no one believes them. There was like an interview with Billy Joel, who's like the Long Island god, and Billy Joel is a pop artist, and everybody from Long Island worships him. You should talk. Go to like Station Pizza and say Billy Joel, and people are like, yeah! All right, Billy Joel. There was this interview with him, and it was basically like, I'm just trying to tell everyone that I'm totally sad and miserable, and everybody's like, nah, you're Billy Joel. And he's like, no, for real, I'm miserable and sad. No, still, we get it, Billy, but you're Billy Joel. It's almost like that's the dominant message. It's either the people who have it all are either super miserable or shoving it in your face all the time that they have it all, which doesn't seem very happy. Every time they're either like, yeah, look at all I got in your face, fool, which I don't think that seems like happiness or contentment. Or they're just totally miserable. It's the Jim Carrey quote. I hope everybody could get rich and famous, and will have everything they ever dreamed of so they know that it's not the answer. Right? I hope you get it all so that you see how miserable it is when you have it. And that's kind of what James is saying. Those things aren't going to do it. Got to take the pack off. It's the only way. Well, finally, the last thing is that James ends on is we can rejoice in suffering because it leads to God. And we get this: blessed is the man who remains steadfast, man or woman who remains steadfast under trial, for when he has stood the test, he will receive the crown of life which God has promised to those who love him. Let no one say when he is tempted, I'm being tempted by God, for God cannot be tempted with evil, and he himself tempts no one. And now we see what the real trial was. The trial, when these people are going through sufferings, was to ask the question, is God really good? That was the trial. So you hit suffering, you hit trouble of various kinds, and the trial is to be like, I think God is actually against me. Because I don't think if God was for me, I would be going through these things. That's what the trial is. And there are people, I'm sure, in this room who've been convinced that God is actually against me. He doesn't want my good. He wants to harm me. Things go bad for me because of God. Well, the answer is actually he's a lot more like Warner Dodge, who knows the way out, who's trying to do the best for his men, who lights the escape fire, says, sit with me, lean into this suffering. This is the way forward. And the ultimate answer to that question, is God really good, always comes back to the cross. The cross is the ultimate answer of, is God really good? The cross is the testament that, yeah, he is. Because he came for us, because he suffered, because he died. The cross is the place where, the definitive place where you look, does God have our interest? Does God care about what's going on? And we look at the bleeding, dying God and say, yeah, he does. So my charge, I guess, to us is maybe not running from suffering. Maybe trusting God to guide us through it. Maybe sitting in that suffering is the place where we meet God, is the place where we grow, is the place where things get better, where we grow closer to God. Even though everything screams to run for comfort, to do everything you can to make that pack as big as possible, to find a way out of the ravine by yourself, it could be that the only way out of the ravine is to sit in it with God. Let's pray together. Father, thank you for who you are. I thank you that you're a good God. I thank you that you're the God even over suffering. You don't tell us why all suffering happens, but you do give us a positive out of it, which is that in those times, in those places of suffering, you are there and you meet us there. For the students who are in this room who are suffering now, I ask that you would be with them, that they would feel your presence, that they would sit with you through it, that they would know that you are a good God who is there for them. In Jesus' name, amen.